I would like your feedback. Let me know if if there are any questions about what I've said, and it'll be great. I'm happy to receive your feedback actually, and you can let me know. I mean, if you're still after these videos, if you're still a little bit um, stumped on say an example for a particular area, just send me an email and I can see if I can dig something out. But let's start with bipartisanship. And if you remember the last time we talked about on most of the hot button issues, the big issues, bipartisanship has been elusive. They've not been able to come to a compromise on a range of issues, and those issues are normally quite deeply ingrained cultural issues. And I said last time that probably gun ownership and the fiasco that is the right to bear arms is probably one of those issues where you're never going to get a bipartisan agreement. Well, I mentioned last time there was a group, a senatorial group of 20 senators, 10 Democrats and 10 Republicans that were discussing gun violence and looking to put through measures that may deal with some of these school shootings and other mass shootings in the United States. And there has been an agreement. Now, the agreement is very minor. I think it's not a strong agreement, and this agreement is going to be tested in the two houses as it has to turn into legislation. But for the first time in 30 years, both parties have accepted that there should be some modest reforms to gun ownership. So some of the reforms include major funding to help states pass and implement crisis intervention orders. So these are these so-called red flag orders that many democratic states have tried to put in place. And that those orders allow law enforcement to just temporarily take away weapons from someone who they recognize to be a danger to others or themselves, right? So someone who's suicidal, someone who's made threats against a partner, for example, or threats against a boss. The police have the right, according to these red flag laws, to confiscate that weapon for a temporary period, right? And for the first time, the Republicans have accepted that that may be a sensible measure. At least these 10 Republicans have accepted that may be a sensible measure. Billions in new funding for mental health and for school safety. Again, this is what the Republicans have been focusing on after the Uvalde attack. That it's the man who committed the horrific crime was mentally disturbed, or that schools need to be their security needs to be spruced up, right? Now, it's a red herring in many ways, and whether that really is the cause of most of these mass shootings is debatable. But there is some movement on that, and it can't do any harm, right? They've agreed to close the so-called boyfriend loophole so that no domestic abuser, a spouse, or a serious dating partner can buy a gun if they are convicted of abuse against their partner. So this is quite considerable because a lot of the shootings in the United States are actually against partners, right? Men against women, usually. And so this will prevent anyone that's been convicted of abuse against a partner from owning a gun. I think that's quite a major move. Now, they didn't agree to increase the federal age limit to buy guns to 21, which was, of course, what Joe Biden wanted. But they've agreed to have enhanced background checks for anyone under 21 who wants to buy guns, buy weapons, and a short pause to conduct those checks, right? And so the argument is that maybe someone at the age of 18 or 19 buys a weapon and it's really to use straight away. And so this is a way of sort of cooling off period to in Texas, for example, on your 18th birthday, you can walk into a shop and purchase a gun and have your gun ready for you, before you could buy a Big Mac at McDonald's, right? And so this would make it a little longer, and as well as that, checks would have to be carried out for people under 21. And this, if it becomes law, would be federal law for all states, for all 50 states. Now, of course, these laws have to be granted, and so it's going to require Congress to pass this legislation. As you know, it's a difficult process, and it may be that much of this is going to be watered down, and it may be that the Republicans are playing a game here. They've accepted these recommendations, but they have no intention to carry these recommendations through as public opinion calms and as the midterms are over. And so we will watch and see whether this bipartisanship will follow through on legislation. The other thing that Biden wanted, by the way, was a ban on assault weapons, right? So these are weapons that are not pistols, weapons that can fire multiple rounds without having to be reloaded. And the administration have argued that why does someone need to have these weapons in their homes, right? Okay, it's all well and fine having a gun or a rifle for farming purposes or for self-defense in your home, but why do you need to have a assault weapon? These are military-grade weapons that people can have with them, and in some states can carry around with them. The committee did not come to a conclusion about that. In fact, the Republicans rejected that recommendation. So we can see some hope of bipartisanship, but excuse me if I sound a little bit skeptical, because I'm not convinced that much of this is actually going to end up as law as it goes through a very gridlocked Congress. And I wonder what the NRA paid congressmen and women would say about a lot of this. So, that again tells us about, I wonder what those senators in Texas and elsewhere who've championed the cause of the NRA, what they would say when it comes to the Senate, for example. Okay. I've got some stats on party polarization that I started in the last session, but it's worth saying a few things more about this. So there was a new report that was published just the other day by the Pew Research Center that found that supporters of the Democrats are divided by cultural issues such as critical race theory. Many of them actually flocked to vote for the Republican Glenn Youngkin in Virginia. If you remember, Glenn Youngkin campaigned on a ticket to outlaw the teaching of critical race theory in schools in Virginia. There was a big question mark as to whether that was ever taught in schools in Virginia, by the way. But he used it as a hot cultural issue to win the state of Virginia. And this poll suggests that a number of moderate liberals also have some very strong reservations about critical race theory. So it transcends the Republicans. The image we almost get is that the Democrats are in favor of trans rights and Black Lives Matter and some of these cultural issues that you could call liberal. But there are a constituency. I think the Pew report argued that it's a minority, but nevertheless a minority of moderate liberals, moderate Democrats who believe that some of these things have gone too far. Right, so they share some of the reservations that Republicans share. It also said that the Republican Party is split over economic questions. So I said last time that the Republican Party is fairly squarely now behind Donald Trump, and that is the case. But amongst Republican voters, there are question marks as to whether as to the economic direction the Republican Party should take. And actually, we saw some of this during the Trump presidency. And I've said here that there's a significant block of Republican voters who are skeptical of banks and large corporations and want them to pay higher taxes. Right now, if you think about it, the Republican Party has been a fiscally conservative party for some time. A Reaganite party that believes in lower taxes and believes in globalization and believes in the power of entrepreneurialism and corporations. But what we discover from this survey and other surveys that there are a significant number of right-leaning people who actually hold left-leaning ideas about corporations. And they wouldn't say it's left-leaning, but they hold very skeptical views about capitalism and about globalization, right? And these observations echo the analysis of David Shaw, Michael Lind, and Lee Drutman and others, that the average voter leans left on the economy and right on culture. And that is a really interesting observation that, the Republican Party today, of course, are squarely behind Trump, but Trump has to reflect some of their reservations they have towards global capitalism. If you remember Donald Trump, he cancelled the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a trade deal that would have created closer ties between the East, excluding China, and the United States. It would have been a free trade arrangement with many Eastern countries. Barack Obama, for years, negotiated this agreement, and Donald Trump decided to get rid of it, right? To overturn it when he became president, and it was seen to be one of the most consequential trade deals in recent history. But Donald Trump, I suppose, he was aware of his Republican base, who have become far more skeptical of global capitalism. And that actually became, the TPP became a rallying call for a lot of the right-leaning, popular right-leaning supporters who argued that corporate America has destroyed their cultural identity and their economic status, right? And I think I talked a bit about this last time round. Now, it's a serious challenge, this, for both parties, because, of course, they have influential factions. On the Democrats, you've got the progressives, led by people like AOC and Elizabeth Warren. And then on the Republican side, you've got people like Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, who are corporate tax cutting Republicans, right? And both wings are being tested by Democrats. So I'm going to talk about some of the primaries that have primary votes that have taken place in places like California, and California those primaries tell us that a lot of Democratic voters are quite tired of the left-wing progressives and believe that some of their policies are a bit too extreme, and we're seeing almost a repudiation of the policies of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and AOC amongst Democratic voters. And that's something that Biden has to be well aware of. And of course, the Republicans use the left as a punching bag against Joe Biden, arguing that he is beholden to the socialists, the left in his party. I said a bit about the Great Replacement theory. I just want to make a comment here about some comments about Republicans. A third of voters in the US believe that there is a plan to replace them with migrants. So these are largely Republicans, but there is a third of voters who believe that in effectively the Great Replacement theory, the idea that migrants are being allowed into the country in order to replace the white population, the native, so-called native white population with migrants, right? Some 35% of Americans, including 68% of Republicans, believe the big lie, pushed relentlessly by Donald Trump and amplified by the conservative media, that the 2020 presidential election was stolen. So you've got a large constituency of people who believe that the election was stolen. Almost 70% of Republican voters believe that Joe Biden is not a rightful president. Now that's unprecedented in history. Whenever you've had fierce contests between rival candidates, one candidate always accepts the outcome. Think about the Al Gore, George Bush election campaign in 2000. It was a very contentious campaign, but at the end of it, Al Gore had to accept that George Bush Jr. was the president, and he publicly said that he is my president, and I have to, I didn't like it, but I have to accept it. Well, we've got a large constituency of Republicans who believe that the vote was a stolen vote, right? If you've been following the Riverton committee hearing, the 6th of January committee hearing, you will hear that the Attorney General resigned in the last days of the Trump presidency when he could no longer accept that Donald Trump was peddling this lie. He argues now that this has gone too far. But Joe Biden is the president. But again, a large number of Americans now don't see eye to eye on these sort of on factual issues. I mean, this is a factual issue, and yet they feel that something was awry in those elections, right? The Republican Party is in trouble. More than 50% of Republican voters believe the crowd that descended upon Congress was a left-leaning mob looking to make Trump look bad, right? So half of Republican voters actually believe that it wasn't the Proud Boys, the extreme right-wing group, or other Republican supporters who ended up storming the House of Representatives and calling for Pence's for the vice president to be hung, but rather there was a left-leaning mob, an Antifa mob, that was responsible for making Donald Trump look bad, right? And again, this is alternative facts. We've now got to a stage in America where people do not believe in some very basic facts. And that's very worrying. Okay. San Francisco. I talked a little bit about some of the primaries and recall elections that are taking place in California. Let's talk about the San Francisco recall against Chesa Boudin, who was the district attorney, and his recall was successful. So there was a recall petition to get rid of the district attorney, because his policies were seen to be way too progressive, right? He was toppled by a campaign fueled by crime concerns and funded by business groups. Former prosecutors from his office had publicly joined the call to recall him, lending credibility to that effort. The progressive district attorney, Chesa Boudin, was a poster boy for progressive criminal justice policies, but he failed to inspire the most liberal city, not in the world, I should have said in America, probably the world, but the most liberal city in America. So let me say a bit about Chesa Boudin. He believed in rehabilitation, and he believed in non-prison offences, and he believed that there were too many prisoners in the state, in the city, and the state, and something needed to change, right? So he pursued a radical series of progressive criminal justice reforms. It backfired. Crime went up, particularly burglaries, during the COVID pandemic, and violent crime went up, right? This created worries amongst some of the citizens of San Francisco. And it also shows us that liberal voters have their limits. If the progressives are to make a claim for popularity, well, we have seen through the progressives really in San Francisco. I mean, this is the most progressive city, as I said. yet they were not ready to re-endorse the policies of Chesabuddin, right? Now you could talk about this in an essay when you talk about political parties and again the problems that Biden faces in keeping his progressive wing in check, because many American voters, in particular, in this case, voters who are naturally Democratic voters, they are unwilling to endorse such radical candidates. And then we get to the case of Rick Caruso, who was until recently a lifetime Republican and a property billionaire. They liken him to Donald Trump. But he recently switched to the Democrats, and he joined the Democratic race, the mayoral contest for Los Angeles. And he has now reached the last stage, the runoff stage, with a well-established black congresswoman who stepped down to stand for mayoralty. He's now heads off with a very well-established Democratic candidate, right? Now, his Democratic credentials are highly questionable. He's never associated himself with the Democratic Party, but he's done so well. And that tells you, again, something about the fickleness, but also about of Democratic voters, but about how much Democratic voters are willing to endorse candidates who his campaign, by the way, was supported by celebrities like Snoop Dogg and Kim Kardashian. I believe they're celebrities, at least I'm told they're celebrities. He campaigned on a promise to be tougher on crime and to deal with the city's homelessness. Now, California as a state has a third of the country's homeless people, and it's effective Los Angeles as the richest of the cities in the state. It's affected Los Angeles in a big way, and he has promised to deal with this issue. I suspect you haven't got time now to listen to podcasts, but there's a great podcast from The Economist called Checks and Balances, and if you get some time, the last program was about California and Los Angeles, and it goes through some of the problems that the Democrats face in its own home territory. I mean, Los Angeles is Democrat territory through and through. Yet you've got this outsider who is marginally a Democrat, who's inspiring large numbers of Democratic voters. Even if he doesn't win, by the way, it's a test of the as I said, the Democrat Party. Right. Let's say a few words about civil liberties in the United States, because again, you could get an essay on civil liberties. I know that much, and it's worth just having some current examples. So on last Wednesday, the US Supreme Court made it nearly impossible for Americans to sue federal law enforcement officers who violate constitutional rights. So these are Customs and Border Protection agents. They number around 20,000 officers. And there was a case brought by Eric Egbert, to cut a long story short, he accused these border security policemen and women. He accused a policeman of injuring him while trying to arrest another man, right? And the 6-3 ruling split along ideological lines, with conservatives in the majority argued that there is almost immunity for those agents from public prosecutions. And that's a setback for migrant rights in the United States. Now, for those of you who attended my Component 2 webinars, you would know that in the same way the Human Rights Act in the UK has been reconfigured to prevent migrants from accessing human rights law, but is going to be reconfigured. But also the Judicial Review Act has prevented migrants from using judicial review as a last resort to prevent their deportation back to their country, right? So in a sense, there's a similar move in both countries to restrict, to deal with the growing tide of migration. And in this case, the Supreme Court now is showing its very strong conservative bias, right? The Supreme Court is also likely to ban affirmative action at universities. So that is something which we are likely to see sometime very soon. The mood music is in that direction, and there's a number of cases raised by, again, Republicans against universities that use or shortlists to deal with some of the historical injustices that black people face in recruiting students for universities. And that may happen, and that would overturn a decades-old policy that some universities have had in order to encourage black students and ethnic minority, but black students to their campuses. There's also a Republican-led move in some Republican-led states to pass new laws restricting transgender youth access to medical care, participation in sports, and the use of bathrooms and changing rooms. As you know, this is a hot-button cultural issue, and many Republican states who are also passing anti-abortion laws are passing laws to prevent young trans people from accessing medical care. In particular, the Arkansas law has garnered widespread attention, and it's seen to be an early legal test of such measures. A first of its kind, Arkansas law prohibiting doctors from providing puberty blockers, hormones, and surgery as part of a gender transition treatment. So young people in Arkansas would not have, doctors will be banned to provide blockers and hormones and surgery to those who want to transition. Right now, again, you can link that to the case in the UK, the Supreme Court case, the appeals court case rather, but overturned an earlier judgment which said that puberty blockers should not be that there should be greater restraints on a NHS clinic providing puberty blockers to trans children, right? And that was overturned by appeal, and so the clinic won its appeal. Well, in the United States, we're seeing the further erosion of trans rights in many of these Republican states. So we're seeing, these Democratic states and Republican states, and these issues are become hot button issues, right? On June the 10th, so a few days back, a U.S. federal judge on Friday threw out a Biden administration directive narrowing who could be targeted by immigration agents for arrest and deportation, siding with officials in Texas and Louisiana. So Joe Biden set out a directive to border officials to limit those people who should be targeted by immigration agents. So, for example, if you're elderly, you should be left alone, or if you're a child, you should be left alone, right? Or if you're pregnant, or things like that, right? And this has been challenged in a federal court in Texas, I believe it was, and they threw out the administration's directive. So again, a further blow to so-called migration rights. Migration has become again one of these hot button issues in the United States, and it is likely to again tear up or to cause real issues in states across the USA. This is really, really important, and I would like to talk about inflation in the United States. So one of the big concerns that Americans are currently facing are concerns about the cost of living crisis, and we have that here in the UK. But in America, this is very acute because for the first time ever, the price of fuel has risen above $5 a gallon, and that's pretty shocking for the United States, which is always prided itself or always had the dubious record of having very low petrol prices, right? So during the coronavirus pandemic, gasoline was under $1.80 a gallon. It hit $3 in May 21, and it passed $4 in March, and it's now $5. So you can see how much of an impact that may have on the lives of ordinary citizens. This is certainly going to play out in the coming elections. Sources have said Biden is planning a trip to Saudi Arabia, a major oil producer that has until now refused to ramp up production. So Saudi Arabia, I mean, Boris Johnson visited Saudi Arabia to try to convince the Saudis to ramp up production. They've got the capacity to do so, but they're refusing to do so at the moment, keeping oil prices very high. Now, Joe Biden, at the very beginning of his presidency, made it very clear that he's not going to deal with Mohammed bin Salman, who's the crown prince responsible for killing a Washington Post journalist in an embassy in Turkey. And so he was persona non grata, someone who would not be dealt with by Biden. When Biden made his first phone call to Saudi Arabia, he refused to make it directly to the crown prince, who really is running the country, and instead he spoke to his elderly and aging, and ailing father, Salman. Right. Well, Mohammed bin Salman has refused to raise oil prices, and Joe Biden is now willing to compromise his human rights ideals and visit Saudi Arabia and in essence give legitimacy to a crown prince who for a long time was refused access to the great and good internationally. So Republicans have called Biden to increase domestic oil production, for example, by allowing drilling on federal lands and offshore, or reversing his decision to revoke a permit for a pipeline that could carry Canadian oil to Gulf refineries. So if you remember, the Keystone XL pipeline was one of the first executive orders of the administration. So he reversed the decision of Donald Trump, who reversed the decision of Barack Obama to not allow this pipeline because of environmental concerns, right? And he's been asked to reverse that decision. Environmentalists, in particular the progressives in the Democratic Party, are up in arms over, the potential of watering down human rights to go and visit Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia. But secondly, there seems now to be a backtracking of environmental concerns in favor of dealing with some of the immediate economic crisis that the country faces. Right. You could draw parallels with the Obama presidency. Obama became president saying that he's going to be the most environmentally conscious president, but he did nothing until the final 2 years of his presidency, and really just for his legacy, he then started to act in 2015. You can say very similar thing. Joe Biden said he's going to put environmental concerns at the center of his policy agenda. But after Glasgow in the UK, the United States faces this crisis, and they're backtracking on a lot of those environmental issues. And that's very similar to the Obama presidency, who was trying to deal with his own economic crisis. The annual inflation rate rose by 8.6% in May. That's a big deal. In other words, the average price of goods has gone up by something like 8.5% in May to the same time the previous year. The US central bank has been raising interest rates since March, and have been doing that. If you know anything about economics, you know that the way you deal with inflation sometimes is to raise interest rates. But by raising interest rates, you're effectively taking more money out of the pockets of ordinary people, right? And analysts had hoped that these moves would have cooled economic activity, easing price measures. But the conflict in Russia and Ukraine has driven price in oil commodities up and has made tackling the problem much more difficult. When you've got external factors that impact on the cost of living, then trying to deal with things by raising interest rates isn't necessarily going to solve the problem, right? One speculation, I was listening to an interview with Ben Bernanke, who is a former head of the Fed. And his argument is that there may be a need to push for the central bank to push America into recession even in order to deal with the inflation crisis. Now, that's a nuclear option, and that doesn't bode well for Biden's presidency because, of course, no president ever wins elections when there's an economic crisis, right? You know, as Bill Clinton once said, as to why he won the election, he said it's the economy, stupid, in '92. So you know, it is a very big possibility that Biden. I mean, I think Biden's got an uphill struggle in the next presidential election, or whoever replaces him has got a uphill struggle, because I think the Republicans are in a far better position to win that election. And that, of course, creates problems for policies. If you've got no continuity, if you can't even have 8 years of continuity, where you've got the houses, but also you've got the House of Representatives and Senate, but also you've got the presidency moving like a ping pong between parties, and then you end up getting the lack of consistency, and that is very possible. Food prices are up more than 10% last month compared to May 21, while energy surged more than 34%. The US has been grappling with rising prices since last year, when an unexpectedly strong economic rebound from the shock of the pandemic drove up large doses of US government spending, including direct checks to households. So they blame a lot of the Biden policies initially of giving money to households directly, and that created a supply crisis because large numbers of people now had incomes to spend. But again, you don't need to know a lot of this detail, but you just need to know that the blame is now being put on some of those early stimulus policies of Joe Biden. The US economy will probably tip into recession next year, according to 70% of leading academic economists who were polled by the Financial Times, right? So let's just say one last slide. Let's say a few words about comparative politics. In your essays, you'll be asked to make comparisons. In your 12 markers, you'll be asked to make comparisons between a number of UK and US institutions and policies. And I think you've just got to focus on, you know this already, but you've got to focus on devolution versus federalism and the difference. You know, in the UK, we can claim to have a quasi-federal system, but the devolution deals across the metro mayors and across the rest of the devolved assemblies are asymmetrical, unlike the federal system in the United States, which is largely symmetrical, right? So you can talk about the difference between those. The Supreme Court we've spoken about a lot, but the Supreme Court in the United States has teeth, whereas the Supreme Court in the UK hasn't really, and you know, it's a weaker court, as you know from your study of UK politics, UK government. There's of course a difference with the constitutions. The United States Constitution is written and codified and entrenched, and that is not the case with the UK Constitution. And arguably, flexibility has won through. If you think about abortion and you think about gun rights, well, maybe the case for a flexible, uncodified constitution today is far greater than a codified constitution that places too much power in the hands of unelected Supreme Court justices. And if the Supreme Court, you know, moves decisively to one political side, then you've then got a deep state. You've got a problem, right, where the Supreme Court is going to work against the governing party, in this case the left, the Democrats, who find it very difficult to overturn a lot of the judgments and laws that you know, one could say what, you know, the Americans were used to for decades. Okay, so you can make comparisons between the Commons and the Lords versus the US legislature, gridlock. You know, as you know, we've got an elective dictatorship in the UK when you've got a majority, and so governments are able to do what they want. and you don't get the gridlock you get in the US legislature. And again, you can make those comparisons. The Parliament Act and the Salisbury Convention allow for Lords to pass legislation without much fanfare, government legislation without many restrictions, and that is not what you see in the United States. You may be asked to make similarities and differences with political parties. And here we can see some similarities. The culture wars that you see in America aggressively fought, you can also see to a smaller degree, but you can also see in the UK, in particular, migration and trans rights and these sorts of things are playing out between and within the political parties here in the UK. I mean, migration certainly is with Priti Patel's pretty abhorrent migration policies to send people to Rwanda, for example, which is, of course, which won its first hurdle in the courts here in the UK. It's now been sent to appeal, and that judgment, I think, will come back today or tomorrow. But again, the point being made here is that there are these overlapping similarities between the Conservative Party and the Republican Party, and how the Conservatives in the UK play some of these cultural cards in order to win the red wall voters and other voters that believe in having tough migration policies, for example. Yes, and you can talk about again the differences between the Prime Minister and President, and presidentialism in the UK and how different that is. I mean, my assessment is, by the way, whenever we talk about the Prime Minister and whether he or she is becoming presidential, actually the argument should be that the UK Prime Minister has far greater powers than a president has. And that is because the Lord Hailsham quote that in the UK, if you've got a majority, you have an elective dictatorship. In the US, as we've said, and as I said in the last session, you just don't have that, right? In the US, you can if you don't have the two houses and you can't get past the supermajority, the 60 majority in the Senate, then your presidency is ailing. Your presidency has a problem. And we've seen that with Joe Biden, but we don't see an equal here in the UK. And so, there is I think the argument is that the UK Prime Minister, because of his or her personal powers, the prerogative powers, as well as because of their majority in the Commons and the laws and conventions that restrict the Lords, the UK Prime Minister actually has much more power than the President of the United States. Lastly, I've put down COVID policies, and it says something about. I said that there's now over 1 million COVID deaths, and part of the problem is the federal system in the United States prevents the federal government from overreaching when it comes to the states. I mean, we've got the Florida governor who not only said that face masks should not be worn at the height of the last wave, but actually said that he's going to ban any school administrators from allowing face masks in schools. So schools in Florida were not allowed to mandate face masks, even in high COVID areas, right? And that shows this tussle between the federal government and the state governors. In the UK, COVID policy was a little bit more joined up. Okay, fine. You did have devolution did impact the incoherency of some of these COVID laws. In Scotland, we had some laws that we didn't have in England. But generally speaking, things were far more smoother, in inverted commas, of course, not as smooth as we would have wanted, but far more smoother because there was more centralizing efforts during, especially in England, during the COVID crisis. Then, health is not devolved to the cities in England, for example. And so you could have more joined up government, right? Right. So that's it from me. I think we've probably covered quite a lot of the contemporary examples you need in your essays. Do contact me if you've got any questions, or if you feel that there's something that I've missed out, and I may send it out as an addition. But good luck with your exam on Wednesday, and I wish you all the best. And hopefully, we'll hear good news from you on results day. But good luck to you all, and I hope actually, I shouldn't say I hope to speak to you soon, because that would imply that you're heading for resits, and that's just not the case, right? So I hope never to speak to you again, because of course you're going to pass your exams with flying colors. See you later, guys. Bye.